begin this morning with the growing opposition to President Trump's immigration crackdown in Minnesota, 11 days after an ICE officer killed Renee Good. Yesterday, tensions flared in Minneapolis with dueling protests. On one side was a pro-ICE demonstration led by right-wing influencer and pardoned January 6th insurrectionist Jake Lang. But his small crowd was eventually outnumbered and driven away by several hundred anti-ICE protesters. Meanwhile, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz has mobilized the National Guard, which is staging to support local law enforcement. And according to the Washington Post, citing defense officials, the Pentagon has ordered roughly 1,500 active duty soldiers to prepare for possible deployment in Minnesota. All of this comes just days after President Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act in the state before saying he would hold off for right now. Yesterday, in an interview with MS Now, Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar slammed Trump for toying with that idea and condemned the Justice Department's investigation into Governor Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey.
We have a president that is itching to have a riot in this city so that he can invoke the Insurrection Act. And that is not something that we want. We do not want the U.S. military in American cities. There's definitely a weaponization of government resources that are happening, but it's also that retribution that the president said he was bringing to Minnesota. The fact that the president thinks it is okay for him to try to charge and bring criminal charges against those that represent us is something that Minnesotans are not going to stand for, and Americans shouldn't either.
Joining us now, MS Now White House reporter Laura Barone Lopez, Paul Butler, former federal prosecutor, professor at Georgetown School of Law and MS Now legal analyst, and David Drucker, senior writer at The Dispatch and an MS Now contributor and author of In Trump's Shadow. Laura, Paul, David, thank you guys so much for joining us. Laura, I want to start with you because the White House seems to be ramping up instead of pulling back, right? Like, usually when things like this happen, whether it's over race and a police-involved shooting or whatever, the White House starts to think, maybe we start to, figure out how to tamper the tension down. This White House only seems to be ramping up. I want to read from Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, Tricia McLaughlin, at the DHS yesterday. This is the largest DHS operation in history. Won't get into resources or numbers of personnel. DHS law enforcement have made over 3,000 arrests since Operation Metro Surge began, including of murderers, rapists, pedophiles, and gang members, with no proof, obviously. 70% of illegal aliens, her words, arrested by ICE nationwide have been charged with or convicted of a crime in the U.S. That last part has been debunked over and over again about who is getting charged and arrested. But this is them ramping up the tensions when really they have some would say a duty to calm things down.
No, they've only been escalating over and over again over the past few weeks. And I think that what we see in Minnesota is this perfect pretext for the president, which is that he has wanted to target Somali immigrants for a very long time. And that's what they said, who they said they were going to target when they escalated the number of immigration agents on the ground. They first went in towards the end of last year as what they would have described as a normal, targeting surge. But then after that viral video from the right-wing influencer, Shirley went crazy in Mogosphere, then they went in even harder and added about 1,000 more or so immigration agents. In total, they say that they have about 3,000, according to sources that I've talked to. There were already about 1,000 on the ground because of people who are stationed there in the area, in the region, in the Twin Cities. So, but still, that is the biggest amount that we've seen in any city since they've been starting these targeted immigration crackdowns.
And now the possibility of actual military members go.
Yes, now that he's threatening the Insurrection Act. So, and again, this is something, like I said, the pretext. It's not just that Trump has wanted to target Somalis. It's also that we've heard him say over and over again that he's not happy with Minnesota because he believes he won it 3 times. He actually lost it 3 times. And so it's this perfect storm of animosities and an immigrant group that he has wanted to target since his first administration, even though he was pushed. There were people in his first administration that pushed back on him that time around.
Paul, I think one of the reasons why the administration is ramping things up is because he is hell-bent, the president is hell-bent on invoking the Insurrection Act. Now, we already know that Minnesota officials have already taken the administration to court over what's been happening on the streets of Minneapolis so far. But put some numbers out here. The Minneapolis police force has about 600 members. The federal government, Trump's ICE and Border Patrol and the likes of Jonathan Ross, those federal officers, total now about 3,000. Now we have reporting that the Pentagon has sent a readiness order to 1,500 members of the military. So if he does do this, invoke the Insurrection Act, the president, what recourse does the state of Minnesota have to stop him?
If the president invokes the Insurrection Act, essentially he would be the new police chief of Minneapolis, and Pete Hegseth would be the deputy chief. The Insurrection Act is when the local officials are not able to put down a rebellion, and it allows the president to activate active duty troops and also federalize the National Guard. We are nowhere near that. The problem is that the Insurrection Act has been invoked so few times by presidents, 30 times in 200 years. It hasn't been invoked since the Rodney King Rebellion, where 25 people were killed. The last time it was invoked without the consent of a governor was on Bloody Sunday in 1964, when Alabama state officers were beating up peaceful civil rights protesters. So we're not anywhere near there. But the fact that it's been used so rarely means that there hasn't been a lot of Supreme Court review. What a lot of legal scholars think is that the president has wide discretion to declare both a rebellion and an insurrection. And we see that the Department of Justice is teeing that up by describing the peaceful protesters in Minneapolis as insurrectionists.
And two things. Bloody Sunday was 1965, and also the Insurrection Act, as we all looked up, the president can just keep it going. There's no time limit on how long that would go on.
But Paul, I want to stick with you for a second and dig a little bit deeper into the Insurrection Act, because obviously we have not seen Trump utilize it yet, but he has given tangible meaning to his threat to deploy the U.S. military to put down what he has called domestic terror in the U.S. I'm thinking about Lafayette Square in 2020 in the wake of the George Floyd protests. You saw Mark Milley appear with the president in his battle fatigues. There was an Army helicopter that descended on a rooftop in Chinatown to frighten and scare the protesters as a show of force. There were snapped trees. There were injured citizens. Is there anything from that incident that we should take to inform what could happen in Minneapolis?
Yes, one that he's rearing to go. He would love to bring in active duty troops to do his will, not just in Minneapolis, but in other cities. Reportedly, what stopped him before during the George Floyd uprisings were that people at the military and the Justice Department during Trump 1.0 told him that it would not be a good idea, really more for political reasons than for legal reasons. One thing that's different now is we've had this recent Supreme Court decision which suggests that he doesn't have the power to use the National Guard in jurisdictions where the governors don't want them there. In that decision, Justice Kavanaugh, he concurred with the majority, but he has a footnote where he basically suggests, I don't know why Trump is relying on this obscure military rule to bring in the National Guard, because all he has to do is invoke the Insurrection Act, and then he can bring in both active duty troops and the National Guard.
So, David, I want to bring you in here. We won't forget about you because you're virtual. One of the things that has been clear for weeks as this has kind of all shaken out is that the American people on both sides, all sides of the aisle, are don't like what they're seeing in the way the ICE is operating. And even in this AP NORC poll on Trump's handling of immigration, 61% disapprove of his handling on immigration. And usually this is kind of his best, this might be his best numbers because all of his numbers are in the tank right now. But this is usually his best number. When you're talking to Republicans, Is it the visuals that they're seeing that is an issue? Is it the way he's doing it that is causing them problems? Because, I was at the RNC when they were all holding the signs that said mass deportation. So they want this to happen, but it appears that the way it's happening seems to cause some of them some consternation.
Yeah, and Eugene, I think it's important to understand here. It's not that the American people, or I should say, voters in the elections that we have focused on recently, particularly in 2024. It's not that they've changed their mind about illegal immigration or border security. They voted for beefed up border security. They liked the idea generally of the government rounding up illegal immigrants who are criminals and deporting them. And I'd say a lot of voters, particularly in the contested swing states, have and still have a problem with this idea that it's okay to be in the country illegally when, and this is how voters will think of it, I have to follow all the rules, I have to pay my taxes, I have to do all these different things. And so there's an issue of fairness. But what a lot of people didn't vote for, and I think we're seeing that in the numbers, is the kind of tactics, number one, that the federal government is employing in American cities to ferret out illegal immigrants and deport them. They didn't vote for this idea that if you look like you could be an illegal immigrant, we're just going to snatch you off the street and detain you indefinitely, even if you claim that you're a citizen. People don't like the idea of living, in a Soviet republic where you have to show your papers everywhere you go. And there's this belief, really, that there's a certain kind of domestic law enforcement, even tough law enforcement, that we expect that, sticks with the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment, search warrants, reasonable suspicion for search and seizure, all sorts of things, and a sort of comportment, right? The way that police officers across the country, by and large, conduct themselves, a certain type of professionalism. And, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency isn't doing that. And that's what these videos are exposing. And I think that's why we've seen the numbers, the president's numbers on immigration go downhill. It's not that they disagree now and have changed their mind on the underlying idea of border enforcement and deporting illegal immigrants, particularly those who are criminals. But the way it is being done, and because it is impacting U.S. citizens who are being demanded to show papers, and if not, arrested in a somewhat brutal fashion. This is the problem the American people, this is the problem voters have, and this is something that Republicans are growing uncomfortable with. But for Republicans on Capitol Hill, as always, a desire to not publicly disagree with the president, even when they disagree with him on substance.